The cold, fluorescent light of the police station buzzed above Naomi's head as she stood frozen in place, her heart pounding against her ribs like a war drum. The words from the officer behind the desk barely registered. No visitors. No exceptions. Your brother has been processed. It felt unreal, like the world had suddenly tilted off its axis, and yet, the reality of it was standing right in front of her. Jalen was in a jail cell, accused of a crime he didn't commit, and the system had already decided his fate before he even had the chance to speak. Marcus placed a firm hand on her shoulder, his presence grounding her for a second, but the fire in her veins was already burning too hot to be tamed. She wasn't going to accept this. Not today. Not ever. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white, her voice sharp, unyielding. I need to see my brother. The officer barely glanced up, the laziness in his expression making her blood boil. He's been booked. You'll have your day in court. The dismissal stung, but she wouldn't back down. This is a mistake. Jalen wasn't even there. He has an alibi. The officer let out a long, exaggerated sigh before flipping through a file on his desk, shaking his head. There's video evidence placing him at the scene. The words hit like a punch to the gut, but Naomi refused to believe them. That's impossible. Marcus spoke before she could, his tone sharp with authority. Where is the footage? The officer didn't flinch. Gas station across the street from the robbery. Matches his description. Naomi could feel the rage bubbling under her skin, but what came next sent a chill through her bones. They found stolen merchandise in his car. It was a setup. It had to be. She turned to Marcus, her mind racing. This wasn't incompetence. This was intentional. Jalen was a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that was all they needed to put him away. The lawyer they had barely lifted his eyes from the folder he was holding, his voice void of any real conviction. This case isn't looking good. Naomi's stomach twisted. That's because you don't want to fight. The man let out a breath, rubbing his temple. It's his word against the evidence. But it wasn't evidence, and she knew that. It was a narrative being forced into place. The same story told over and over again. They wanted Jalen to take a deal, to plead guilty, to become another statistic. That wasn't happening. Marcus was already dialing numbers, calling in favors, trying to break through the system that was actively working against them. They're blocking us. His voice was tight with frustration. No one wants to get involved. Naomi felt the weight of it pressing against her, but she wasn't about to fold. Then we take it to the people. It took one post. One raw, emotional plea, exposing every detail of the injustice. My brother, Jalen Carter, was arrested for a crime he didn't commit. They planted evidence. They're trying to break him. We won't let them. She attached his photo, his warm smile, his bright eyes, the innocence in his face that they were trying to erase. She didn't expect it to explode the way it did. Within hours, thousands of shares, comments flooding in, outrage building like a tidal wave. The support was overwhelming, but so were the threats. Stay quiet. Drop it. Don't make this mistake. Anonymous messages filled her inbox, warning her that she was stepping into something bigger than she could handle. But Naomi didn't care. She had already made her decision. Marcus stood beside her, his phone in hand, his expression unreadable. They're watching. The weight of it settled between them, heavy and unspoken. Naomi met his gaze, her determination unshaken. Could let them watch. Because this wasn't just about Jalen anymore. This was about every single black man who had been forced into silence, every family that had been torn apart by a system designed to break them. Naomi wasn't just fighting for her brother. She was fighting for all of them. And she wasn't going to stop. Not until they listened. The morning after Naomi's post went viral, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. News outlets flooded her inbox, journalists eager to get the exclusive on the woman challenging the system. At first, she hesitated. Letting them into her life, exposing her family even more, felt like walking into a battlefield without armor. But this wasn't just about her anymore. So she sat in front of the camera, back straight, voice unwavering, and told the world the truth. She spoke about Jalen, about how he'd always been the kind of person who gave more than he had, how he took care of their mother when Naomi moved out, how he stayed out of trouble because he knew the world wouldn't give him second chances. And then she spoke about the injustice, how the police planted evidence, how they twisted reality to fit their own narrative, how they turned black men into criminals before they even had a chance to defend themselves. The interview aired that evening, and by nightfall, the streets were filled with people chanting Jalen's name, demanding his release, holding up signs with his face on them. The movement was no longer just online. It was real. It was loud. It was everywhere. But the system wasn't going to sit back and let them win. The next day, new headlines surfaced. Surveillance footage raises questions about Carter's innocence. Prior arrest record uncovered. The articles painted Jalen as a repeat offender, twisting minor infractions into something far more sinister. News anchors dissected his past, debating whether he was really the good man Naomi claimed him to be. Some outlets stood by her, exposing the corruption in the case, but others latched onto the false narrative, eager to tear her family apart. Naomi scrolled through the articles, her stomach turning. "They're doing exactly what I said they would," she muttered, shoving her phone away. "They're making him the villain." Marcus stood beside her, arms crossed, his jaw tight with frustration. This was always going to happen. He had warned her. He knew the system wouldn't let them win without a fight. But knowing it didn't make it easier. Then the first real warning came. Marcus walked into their home that evening, his face unreadable. He closed the door behind him, set his briefcase down with a little too much force, and exhaled sharply. Naomi looked up from the kitchen table, sensing the shift immediately. What happened? He didn't answer right away. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and handed it to her. She stared at the screen. It was a message. No name. Just a number she didn't recognize. "Tell your wife to stop. You still have a future. Don't throw it away." A chill ran down her spine, but she masked it with anger. "Who sent this?" Marcus ran a hand over his face. "My boss. Indirectly, of course. He says if I don't step back, my career is over." Naomi clenched her fists, her mind racing. So that's their play. Threaten us into silence. She could see it now, how they expected her to fold, to let fear win. But Marcus wasn't done. "It's not just my job, Naomi. They're watching us. Watching you." His voice was laced with something she wasn't used to hearing from him. "We need to be smart about this." But Naomi's patience had run dry. "Smart," she snapped. "Jalen is rotting in a jail cell while they destroy his name, and you want to play it safe?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "I want to protect my family." And for the first time since this all started, they weren't on the same page. Naomi's voice dropped to a whisper, her chest tight with emotion. "If we stop now, we let them win." Silence stretched between them. He knew she was right. But knowing didn't make it easier. The knock on the door came late. Marcus hesitated before opening it, instincts screaming caution. When he did, he found himself staring at a man he didn't recognize, tall, broad-shouldered, with the rigid posture of someone who had spent years in uniform. "Marcus Carter?" the man asked, voice low, steady. "I need to talk." Naomi appeared behind her husband, crossing her arms. "And you are?" The man exhaled, glancing over his shoulder before stepping inside. "Derek Owens. Former officer. I know what they did to your brother, and I have proof." Naomi's skepticism was instant. "Why should we trust you?" Owens pulled out a flash drive, setting it on the table between them. "Because I was part of the system that put him away." His words landed like a hammer, but he didn't waver. "I saw things I shouldn't have. I kept quiet for too long. Your fight, it's real. But you won't win without this." Naomi grabbed the drive before Marcus could stop her. "What's on it?" Owens' jaw clenched. Enough to tear their case apart. False reports. Planted evidence. And names of the officers who made it happen. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. If this was real, it changed everything. Naomi studied the man, searching for deceit. But all she saw was exhaustion. Regret. The next day, the city streets pulsed with energy. The protest had grown beyond anything they had expected, hundreds marching, chanting Jalen's name, demanding justice. Naomi stood at the front, gripping the megaphone, her voice unwavering. "We will not be silenced." The crowd roared. But tension coiled in the air, thick and heavy. Marcus noticed them first, the officers lining the edges of the protest, their stances too rigid, their hands too close to their weapons. Something was wrong. Then it happened. A single shove. A sudden crack. A thrown object. Panic spread like wildfire. People ran. Screams cut through the night. Tear gas filled the air, burning eyes, choking throats. The peaceful protest had become a battlefield. Naomi tried to hold her ground, tried to keep control, but the surge of chaos swallowed everything. Cameras flashed. The world was watching. By the time Naomi realized what was happening, it was too late. Hands grabbed her arms, twisting them behind her back. "You're under arrest." The words barely registered. She struggled, but the cuffs bit into her wrists. "For what?" she demanded. The officer smirked. "Inciting a riot." The weight of those words sent ice through her veins. This was their move. Their way of silencing her. She was shoved forward, the sea of protesters parting as she was dragged away. Marcus pushed through the chaos, shouting her name, but the officers held him back. Naomi locked eyes with him, her mind racing. "Don't let them win," she shouted before they shoved her into the police car. Marcus barely heard his own breath as he stormed into the lawyer's office. "We need to get her out." The lawyer sighed, shaking his head. "It's not that simple." Marcus slammed his hands on the desk. "They're framing her. You know that." The lawyer met his gaze, calm but firm. "This isn't just about evidence anymore. They want to make an example out of her." Marcus clenched his fists. He had always believed in the law. In justice. But now, standing here, he realized justice was only real for those who had the power to control it. And right now, they had none. The offer came in a sealed envelope, slid across the table by a man in a gray suit with a calm expression that didn't match the weight of his words. Marcus stared at the neatly printed letter, the message chilling in its simplicity. "Admit your wife and brother-in-law are guilty, denounce your actions publicly, and Naomi walks free." The air felt heavy. "This is your way out," the man said smoothly, adjusting his cufflinks. "Your family gets to move on. No more threats, no more consequences. Just one statement, Mr. Carter." Marcus felt bile rise in his throat. They wanted him to betray everything. To erase Naomi's fight. To let Jalen rot in prison while they pretended justice had been served. He gripped the paper, his pulse pounding, but he already knew this was not an option. He drove through the city, past the banners with Naomi's face, past the protesters still holding signs demanding her release. The weight of their hope pressed against his chest. When he reached the meeting place, a dimly lit office deep in the city, he wasn't sure what to expect. The people inside weren't journalists or politicians. They weren't activists with slogans. They were strategists, professionals who had fought battles like this before. A woman with steel-gray hair stepped forward. "Mr. Carter," she said, voice clipped but firm. "We know what they offered you. We have another option." She laid out the plan in precise, deliberate words. They could get Naomi out. Not through the courts, not through appeals, but through action. A forced extraction, coordinated, calculated. A safe house. A new identity. A way to vanish, to start over where no one could touch them. "It won't be clean," she warned. "It won't be easy. But it's better than watching them destroy her." The weight of the decision pressed down on Marcus like a vice. Freedom at the cost of everything else. He thought of Naomi, locked away, her voice silenced, her fight unfinished. He thought of Jalen, forgotten by a system designed to bury men like him. He thought of himself, the life he had built, the career he had sacrificed everything for. And then he thought of the envelope, the ultimatum, the demand that he bow. He wouldn't run. He wouldn't let them turn this into another story of a black family crushed beneath the system's weight. He would fight. The press conference was hastily arranged, the room packed with journalists, cameras, microphones waiting to amplify his words. Marcus stepped onto the stage, his hands steady despite the storm inside him. The moment stretched, the silence before the explosion. And then he spoke. He spoke of corruption, of fabricated evidence, of a system that had declared war on his family. He named names. He exposed the deal they had offered him, daring them to deny it. He burned the last bridges he had left, knowing there would be no return. The aftermath was instant. His phone buzzed with messages, some in support, others filled with venom. His job was gone, fired before he even stepped off the stage. Officials scrambled to control the narrative. But the people had heard him. The fire had already started, and no amount of silence could put it out. The fallout was immediate, brutal, and absolute. Marcus barely had time to process the aftermath of his speech before the walls started closing in. His phone rang once. His supervisor, his voice cold, clinical. "You're done, Carter." Effective immediately. The line went dead before Marcus could respond. The email arrived minutes later, the official termination notice stamped with bureaucratic indifference. His bank app refused to load, an error message flashing every time he tried to access their funds. Naomi's accounts were frozen too. Their mortgage, their savings, the house they had built their lives in was no longer theirs. When he stepped outside that morning, reporters swarmed like vultures, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward him. And then came the unmarked cars, watching, waiting. He knew what this meant. They weren't just cutting him off, they were erasing him. They packed what little they could, fleeing under the cover of night, moving between safe houses, relying on friends, allies, anyone who would take them in. Fear coiled in Marcus's gut, but Naomi remained unshaken. "They want us to break," she whispered in the dark. "We don't." But it got harder every day. Resources dwindled. Trust was a fragile thing. And then it shattered. He didn't want to believe it. Couldn't. But the signs were there. The way meetings felt compromised, the way their locations were suddenly known. One of their own had betrayed them. The truth came in a text, anonymous but clear: "You're not safe. Someone close is feeding them everything." Rage boiled in Marcus's chest. He had risked everything, lost everything, and now this? He retraced every step, every conversation, every name. And then he saw it, the missing piece. The man who had inserted himself into their fight so seamlessly. The one who had promised security, promised inside information. The one who had positioned himself as a friend but had been leading them into a trap. They had trusted a snake. There was no time for second-guessing. They ran again, but the net was closing. The chase ended in a dimly lit parking garage, tires screeching as Marcus skidded to a stop, headlights cutting through the haze of exhaust and shadows. He wasn't surprised to see the figure waiting for him. Captain Reynolds. The man who had orchestrated this war from the beginning. The man who now stepped forward, hands in his pockets, eyes gleaming with smug satisfaction. "You put up a good fight," Reynolds said, voice calm, almost amused. "But we both know how this ends." He tossed a folder onto the hood of the car. Inside, Marcus saw documents, sealed deals, police reports, falsified evidence. And at the top, a single offer. "Walk away," Reynolds continued. "Stop your crusade. Let it go. In return, we let Jalen go. No charges, no prison. He walks free. Your wife gets to breathe again. You, however," his smirk widened. "Well, let's just say you'll be better off disappearing." Marcus stared at the papers, at the devil's bargain laid before him. The weight of it all pressed down, suffocating. Freedom for his family, but at what cost? His silence? His soul? His fight? The answer clawed at him, screaming to be chosen. The decision had to be made. Marcus stood frozen, staring at the documents that could end everything. His hands curled into fists, the weight of Reynolds' offer pressing down like a vice. Naomi's voice cut through the tension, sharp and unwavering. "No, absolutely not." She stepped forward, grabbing the folder and throwing it to the ground. "We don't negotiate with criminals. We don't let them win." But Marcus wasn't so sure anymore. The fight had taken everything from them. Their home, their safety, their future. Jalen was rotting behind bars, and every day brought them closer to losing him forever. Was pride worth more than his brother's life? "Name me too, listen to me," he said, voice low, controlled, but heavy with doubt. "What if this is the only way? What if fighting means losing him?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "Then we fight harder." But doubt had already sunk its claws into him. The cost of this war had been relentless. He had to ask himself, was there even a path to victory anymore? Before either of them could say another word, Naomi's phone buzzed. She frowned, checking the message. Then she went still. Her fingers tightened around the device, her face draining of color. They moved him. The words barely escaped her lips. Marcus felt his stomach drop. What? She swallowed hard, eyes locked on the screen. They transferred Jalen. Maximum security. No warning. No legal process. Just gone. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a move. This was a death sentence. Jalen wasn't a gang member, wasn't connected, wasn't protected. A transfer like this meant only one thing. They were putting him somewhere he wouldn't survive. A cold, sharp fear stabbed through Marcus. We need to find out where, he said, grabbing his phone. He dialed the lawyer, the contact at the courthouse, anyone who could give them an answer. No one picked up. The silence was deafening. Naomi's hands shook, but she didn't break. They're pushing us into a corner. They want us desperate. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. We need leverage. And then the message came. Anonymous, untraceable, sent to a secured inbox they barely used anymore. Marcus clicked the link. A grainy video loaded. And what they saw made their blood run cold. It was surveillance footage. Inside a dimly lit alley. A man on his knees. A group of officers standing over him. A flash of a badge, a low murmur of voices, then the sickening sound of a gunshot. The body collapsed. The officers turned away, their faces catching the light just long enough to be identified. Corrupt cops. The same ones who had framed Jalen. The same ones who were silencing witnesses, eliminating threats. This was proof. Naomi pressed a hand to her mouth, shaking her head. This changes everything. But Marcus saw the problem immediately. If we post this, they'll come after us harder than ever. It wouldn't just be threats anymore. They would be targets. The kind that don't get second chances. Naomi knew it too, but her eyes were fierce. Determined. Then we don't just post it. We go public. We go big. We make sure that once this is out, there's no way to bury it. He nodded slowly. We'll need protection. Someone with reach. They exchanged a look. There was only one option. One last desperate play. We need to take this to the press. Marcus gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, his heart pounding like a war drum. The city lights faded behind them, swallowed by the endless stretch of the highway. Naomi sat beside him, silent but tense, her fingers digging into the armrest. The weight of everything pressed against them, suffocating, relentless. They had left behind everything. Friends, familiar streets, any semblance of normalcy. Their names were no longer just names. They were targets, etched into lists of people who had dared to defy the system. The air inside the car was thick with unspoken fear. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the distant sirens that still echoed in their ears. They drove through the night, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Every gas station felt like a risk. Every glance from a stranger felt like a threat. They changed plates, switched cars, took routes that twisted through back roads and empty highways. Naomi barely spoke, but when she did, her voice was steel. We don't stop until we're safe. But where was safe? Nowhere. Not anymore. By the time they reached their destination, exhaustion clung to them like a second skin. The safe house was nothing more than a cramped apartment in a city that wasn't theirs, borrowed from someone who knew someone who owed a favor. The walls were bare, the air stale, the tension unshakable. Marcus bolted the door behind them, exhaling for what felt like the first time in hours. Naomi wasted no time. We need allies. She was already moving, already reaching out, already looking for a way to turn survival into action. The first meeting happened in the dead of night, in a rundown cafe that smelled of burnt coffee and desperation. They weren't alone anymore. Others had been watching, waiting, hoping for someone to stand up first. There was a man who had lost his son to the same corrupt officers who framed Jalen. A journalist who had been silenced too many times. A former public defender who had seen too much, lost too much, and had finally decided that fear was no longer an option. They shared their stories, their grief, their rage. And then they started planning. The evidence they had wasn't just a weapon, it was a reckoning waiting to happen. Videos, documents, testimonies, proof of years of abuse, of power unchecked, of a system built to protect itself at any cost. The plan was dangerous. It had to be. They couldn't just leak the files and hope for justice. They had to make sure the whole world was watching. "We go public," Naomi said, her voice steady. "But not just online. We make it impossible to ignore." There would be press conferences, whistleblowers willing to speak, a coordinated release of information that couldn't be buried, twisted, or erased. Marcus knew the risks. He knew what happened to people who pushed too hard. But as he looked around the room, at faces filled with grief and determination, he knew there was no turning back. This was it. Their last chance to fight. To win. Or to lose everything. The files hit the internet like a wildfire, spreading faster than anyone could contain. Leaked documents, hidden footage, voice recordings, all undeniable, all damning. News outlets picked up the story within hours, first independent journalists, then major networks. The faces of corrupt officers flashed across screens, their crimes laid bare for the world to see. There was no stopping it now. The truth was out. Naomi watched the numbers climb, shares, comments, headlines in different languages. Her fingers trembled over the keyboard, but not from fear. This was it. This was what they had fought for. Marcus stood behind her, his jaw tight, his hands fists at his sides. Now we wait. But the system did not wait. It retaliated. The police department issued a statement within the hour, denying everything, calling it a fabricated smear campaign orchestrated by criminals. The mayor vowed an investigation, but it was nothing more than a delay tactic. Then came the real response. Accounts tied to the activists were suspended, their emails hacked, their locations traced. Internet service faltered. Phones died. Naomi's screen suddenly flooded with error messages. "They're shutting us down," she whispered. And then the physical attacks began. Power cut out in the safe house, plunging them into darkness. Outside, unmarked cars appeared, their engines idling in the streets. The journalist who had helped them vanished without a trace. The ex-officer who had come forward was found beaten in an alley, left barely breathing. Marcus cursed under his breath, grabbing Naomi's arm, pulling her away from the window. "We need to move." No. But before they could even reach the door, their phones buzzed in unison. A message from an unknown number. "You can't run forever." Naomi's heart pounded against her ribs, but she forced herself to stay calm. They had expected this. The fight was never going to be easy. "We stick to the plan," she said, her voice steady. "We make them regret underestimating us." But even as she said it, she felt the shift in the air. Something was wrong. The meeting place was compromised. They had agreed to regroup at an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, but the moment Marcus pulled up, he knew it was a trap. The lot was too empty, too clean, too quiet. His instincts screamed at him to turn back. But it was too late. The second he reached for the gear shift, headlights flared to life all around them. Vehicles emerged from the darkness, blocking every exit. Armed men stepped forward, badges glinting under the streetlights. Out of the car. "Hands where we can see them." The voice came from a familiar face, one of their own. A man they had trusted. A man who had just sold them out. Naomi's breath caught. "No, not like this." Marcus's grip tightened on the wheel, his mind racing for an escape. But there was none. The betrayal cut deeper than the fear. They had come so close. They had almost won. But now they were trapped. The system had struck back. And this time, it wouldn't let go. They were dragged from the car with rough hands, thrown to the ground, wrists forced behind their backs as cold metal cuffs bit into their skin. Marcus gritted his teeth as boots pressed down on his back, pinning him to the pavement. Naomi struggled against the grip of two officers, her breath coming in short, furious bursts. The world spun around them, sirens wailing, shouts blending into the chaos. Cameras flashed from the shadows. Journalists, protesters, witnesses. The world was watching. But it didn't matter. The system had them now, and yet the city was burning. The arrest set off a spark that turned into an inferno. Within hours, thousands flooded the streets, chanting their names, demanding justice. News helicopters hovered over crowds that stretched for miles, people raising their fists, carrying signs with words that could no longer be ignored. Police barricades crumbled under the weight of the people. Government buildings were surrounded, pressure mounting with every second. The authorities had made a mistake. Instead of silencing them, they had made them symbols. Marcus and Naomi were shoved into separate vans, metal doors slamming shut between them. The rumble of the engine drowned out the outside noise, but the pounding in Marcus's chest remained deafening. He twisted against the restraints, trying to see her, trying to reach her. Naomi. His voice was raw, desperate. He heard her response, faint but unwavering. They can't stop this, Marcus. No matter what happens. The van jerked forward. The last thing he saw through the barred window was fire rising against the night sky. They were taken to an undisclosed location, stripped of their belongings, their names reduced to numbers. The walls reeked of sweat and fear, the air thick with unspoken threats. Marcus was thrown into a separate holding cell, his knuckles bleeding from where he had fought back. Across the hall, Naomi stood tall, refusing to let them see her break. For a moment, their eyes met. And in that moment, they understood. This was the price of truth. Time blurred. Hours, maybe days passed. Then came the trial. A spectacle meant to pacify the masses. The prosecution painted them as agitators, criminals, a danger to society. Evidence was twisted, facts distorted. But the people did not waver. Protests grew louder, international leaders called for intervention, organizations demanded their release. The government was backed into a corner. In the end, they compromised. Charges were reduced, sentences lessened. But freedom was still out of reach. Naomi and Marcus were sentenced. Not for life. Not forever. But long enough to remind the world that justice was still just an illusion. The gavel struck. The court erupted. And the revolution continued. The world watched as the prison gates creaked open, and Jalen stepped out into the blinding sunlight, his face thin, his body worn but unbroken. The crowd roared, fists raised, banners waving, voices merging into one deafening cry of victory. Cameras flashed, reporters surged forward, but Jalen's eyes searched for only one face. Naomi stood at the front, her body trembling with relief, her hands covering her mouth as she ran toward him. He caught her in a crushing embrace, his voice hoarse from months of silence. "We made it." But her eyes, red-rimmed, haunted, told him otherwise. They hadn't all made it. Marcus was still behind bars. The protests had shaken the system to its core. International pressure had become unbearable. The government had been forced to act. They released Jalen. They lessened Naomi's charges, bowing to the relentless demands of human rights groups. But Marcus? He was the warning, the example, the price. The judge had delivered the sentence with cold detachment, 15 years. Enough to break most men. Naomi stood outside the courthouse, staring at the massive steel doors that had swallowed the man she loved. Her chest ached with fury, with helplessness, with the weight of everything they had lost. A deal had been struck in backrooms far from public eyes. The system had conceded just enough to quiet the streets, just enough to make people believe change had come. But she knew the truth. They hadn't won. Not completely. Days blurred into weeks. The world moved on, but Naomi didn't. She refused. She spoke at rallies, met with leaders, fought in rooms where decisions were made, her voice rising where others fell silent. She became more than just a woman who had lost. She became the face of a movement, a symbol of resistance, of defiance. But symbols didn't feel. Symbols didn't grieve. She sat alone in their empty apartment, staring at the chair where Marcus used to sit, his laughter still echoing in her mind. The victory was hollow. The war was not over. The last time she saw him, they were separated by thick glass, telephones pressed to their ears, guards watching their every move. He smiled, tired but unbroken. "You have to keep going, Naomi." Her fingers curled against the cold surface. "I don't know how." His voice was firm, steady. "You already are." The line went dead. The visit ended. The fight continued,